There is a particular kind of exhaustion that only talk show hosts understand. It isn't the exhaustion of long hours or early mornings or the relentless pressure of live television. It's something quieter and more corrosive than any of that. It's the exhaustion of sitting across from someone for 30 minutes, pouring every ounce of your charm, your wit, your professional grace into a conversation, and receiving almost nothing in return. Or worse, receiving too much of the wrong thing entirely. Graham Norton knows this exhaustion better than almost anyone alive. For more than 2 decades, Norton has been the undisputed master of the British talk show format. His Friday night program on the BBC has become something of a national institution, the kind of television that families gather around, that people stay up too late to watch, that generates Monday morning conversations in offices across the country. The Red Sofa has hosted presidents and pop stars, Oscar winners and first-time novelists, sporting legends and comedians who went on to become legends themselves. Norton has made it all look effortless, and that effortlessness is, of course, the greatest illusion in show business. Because behind every smooth, laughter-filled hour of television, there are stories that never quite make it to air. Tensions that the editing sweet smooths over. Moments that the host files away in some private mental cabinet marked never again. Graham Norton, now 62, and with the kind of perspective that only comes from decades at the top of his profession, has slowly, carefully, and with characteristic Irish honesty begun to let some of those stories breathe. Not with bitterness, not with the score-settling energy of a man who feels wronged, but with the frank acknowledgement of someone who has earned the right to tell the truth about what his job actually costs. The guests he struggled with weren't always the ones you'd expect. Sometimes the most difficult nights weren't caused by ego or arrogance or bad behavior. Sometimes they were caused by silence, by indifference, by the particular cruelty of a person who simply doesn't want to be in a room with you, no matter how hard you work to make them feel welcome. Norton has spoken about these experiences in interviews, in his memoir, in offhand comments that have lodged themselves in the memory of anyone paying attention. And taken together, they form a portrait of a man who loves his job with genuine passion, but has never been naive about its difficulties. This is the story of 6 guests who tested Graham Norton in ways that the cameras could only partially capture. 6 nights that reminded him, and the millions watching at home, that chemistry cannot be manufactured, charm has its limits, and even the most gifted host in the world is only ever one bad booking away from the longest half hour of his life. Mark Wahlberg, the night chaos walked through the door. The year was 2013, and the Graham Norton show was operating at the peak of its considerable powers. The Friday night slot had become appointment television on a global scale, and the episode in question had every ingredient for a classic evening. Michael Fassbender was on the couch, sharp and charming as ever, a man who understood the rhythm of the show and played it like an instrument. Sarah Silverman was there too, quick-fire and unafraid, exactly the kind of guest who makes Norton's job feel less like work and more like a very good party. And then there was Mark Wahlberg. Wahlberg arrived trailing the kind of energy that initially reads as high spirits. His swagger was louder than usual, his timing slightly off, his laughter arriving a beat or two after everyone else's. The audience picked up on it quickly, and for the first few minutes, there was something almost entertaining about it. He seemed like a man who had decided to have a very good time and wasn't going to let anything get in the way of that decision. Norton, always skilled at reading a room, tried to channel the energy rather than resist it, steering the conversation in directions that might accommodate whatever state Wahlberg had arrived in. But accommodation has its limits. As the segment progressed, it became clear that Wahlberg wasn't simply in high spirits. He was intoxicated in the way that only becomes genuinely uncomfortable when it moves from loose to uncontrolled. He interrupted Fassbender repeatedly, cutting across stories and anecdotes with non-sequiturs that landed in the silence like stones dropped in still water. When Silverman tried to tell a story, Wahlberg leaned across her physical space, his voice riding over hers as though she wasn't there. The laughter in the audience grew more nervous. The kind of laughter that happens when people aren't quite sure if they're watching something funny or something they'll feel bad about later. Then came the moment that lodged itself permanently in the collective memory of everyone who witnessed it. Without warning, and seemingly without a great deal of planning, Wahlberg rose from the sofa, stumbled almost imperceptibly, and deposited himself directly into Graham Norton's lap. He threw an arm around the host's shoulders with the casual confidence of a man who had decided this was simply the logical next step in the evening's proceedings, said something that the microphones couldn't quite render intelligible, and laughed with the full-bodied delight of someone who found himself hilarious. Norton's response in that moment became the subject of considerable professional admiration afterward. He smiled. He kept the laughter going. He made a light comment that acknowledged the absurdity of the situation without shaming anyone, and his eyes, for just a fraction of a second, revealed the cost of all that professionalism. The audience saw a man working very, very hard to make chaos look like entertainment. After the episode aired, it became one of the most discussed moments the show had produced in years. Some viewers found it genuinely hilarious, a moment of unpredictable television that reminded everyone why live broadcasting still matters. Others found it harder to watch, particularly Silverman's visible discomfort in the moments when Wahlberg's behavior made her the collateral damage of someone else's performance. Norton himself, speaking about it later with the dry understatement that is his natural register, said simply that the night had left him exhausted in a way that took time to shake. He was just gone, Norton recalled. Completely gone. Wahlberg later made light of it, acknowledging he'd had a few drinks before appearing and treating the memory as though it were a funny story rather than a significant imposition. For the man whose lap he'd occupied, it was a more complicated evening than that. Robert De Niro, the weight of silence. If Wahlberg was a storm, De Niro was a drought. When one of the most celebrated actors in the history of cinema settles onto the red sofa, there is a set of expectations that comes with him. People want to glimpse the interior of a legend. They want the stories, the anecdotes, the offhand revelations that only emerge in a relaxed, informal setting. They want to see the man behind the myth. What they got when Robert De Niro appeared on the Graham Norton show was a lesson in the true meaning of inscrutability. De Niro's reputation for being a private and often guarded person in public settings was well established before the interview. Norton knew this. He had done his preparation, identified the angles most likely to produce engagement, and arrived at the conversation with what he later described as genuine curiosity about the man. None of it was enough. From the moment De Niro settled into the sofa, there was a quality to his presence that suggested he had come under some kind of duress, that this was an obligation being fulfilled rather than an opportunity being embraced. His answers were short in the way that suggests not brevity but resistance. Words chosen for their function of ending questions rather than opening conversations. Norton tried everything in his considerable arsenal. He tried humor, the gentle, self-deprecating kind that usually makes guests lean forward. He tried flattery, specific and genuine, the kind that acknowledges actual work rather than trafficking in vague praise. He tried tangential approaches, coming at subjects from unexpected angles in the hope of catching De Niro off guard in a way that might produce something spontaneous. At one point, after a response that amounted to perhaps 4 words, Norton allowed himself a small, visible moment of candor. "This is hard work, Robert," he said, and the audience laughed in the way audiences laugh when a host has articulated precisely what everyone in the room is feeling. De Niro offered a faint smile that contained no particular invitation to continue. What made the interview so singular, and what Norton has reflected on with more generosity than the experience perhaps warranted, was the absence of hostility in De Niro's manner. He wasn't rude. He wasn't contemptuous. He was simply somewhere else, occupying the physical space of the couch, while his attention and his willingness remained behind a door that Norton's charm couldn't find the handle to. The contrast between the two men, Norton vibrating with the particular frequency of someone who genuinely loves conversation, and De Niro sitting in a quiet that felt deliberately constructed, made the segment feel like watching two people play different games by different rules with no shared vocabulary to negotiate between them. Norton carried it. That was the only option available to him. And he did it with the skill of a man who has spent years learning how to make one-sided conversations feel bilateral. But the effort showed, and he has been honest about that cost. Some guests just don't like to talk, he said afterward, with the philosophical acceptance of someone who has made his peace with a difficult truth. And that's fine. But when it's live television, you have to make silence look entertaining. The De Niro episode became, in certain circles, a kind of masterclass in talk show hosting under adverse conditions. The lesson was, when the legend gives you nothing, you give the audience everything you have, and you hope it's enough. Harvey Weinstein, the shadow that came before the storm. There are interviews that feel uncomfortable in the moment and reveal nothing beyond their discomfort. And then there are interviews that feel uncomfortable in the moment and years later reveal everything. Graham Norton's encounter with Harvey Weinstein belongs firmly in the second category, and it is impossible to discuss it now without feeling the weight of what came after pressing down on every detail of what came before. At the time of his appearance, Weinstein was one of the most powerful figures in Hollywood. He arrived at the Norton show not as a guest, but as a force of nature, or perhaps more accurately as a force of ego. The distinction matters because there is a particular kind of powerful person who mistakes a talk show couch for a throne, who enters a room designed for warmth and laughter and immediately begins reorganizing it around their own dominance. Weinstein was, by multiple accounts of those present, exactly that kind of person. He dominated from the moment he sat down. He interrupted other guests with the casual impunity of someone who had never developed the habit of considering other people's boundaries. He cut Norton off mid-sentence, not as an accident of enthusiasm, but as a demonstration that he operated outside the normal rules of conversational courtesy. Every question that Norton directed at him was answered in a way that circled back to Weinstein's own importance, his own achievements, his own position in the industry he had spent decades accumulating power within. The show's natural warmth, the thing that makes the Norton format work on a fundamental level, evaporated under the heat of his self-regard. Norton has described his own discomfort during that interview with words that became more resonant once the full truth about Weinstein emerged publicly. He was visibly strained in a way he almost never is on camera, his famous composure wearing thin at the edges, his polite smile requiring visible maintenance. The audience felt it too. The laughter was thinner than usual. The ease that typically fills the studio like warm air was absent, replaced by something harder to name, a collective unease that people experienced but couldn't quite articulate. When Weinstein's crimes became public knowledge and his career collapsed in the avalanche of testimony and accusation that characterized the earliest and most significant wave of the #MeToo movement, Norton revisited that interview with the particular clarity that comes from knowing the end of a story before you've fully processed its beginning. "I had no idea at the time," he said quietly, "but looking back, it all makes sense." He didn't elaborate significantly beyond that, and the restraint was itself communicative. The footage still exists, circulating in corners of the internet where people go to watch history in the process of becoming itself. Most people find it genuinely uncomfortable viewing now, less because of what happened on camera than because of what they know happened off it over years and in rooms that no camera ever captured. For Norton, that interview became a haunting of a particular kind. Not a memory of something that went wrong in the conventional sense of live television going wrong, but a memory of something that felt wrong in ways he couldn't name at the time and now can name all too clearly. It was a reminder that charisma and power can occupy the same body as darkness, and that sometimes the most telling thing about a person is precisely the way they treat a room that they think they can control. There is a version of Mickey Rourke that the public carries in its imagination, the beautiful, dangerous, magnetic presence of the early films, the actor who seemed for a time to be operating on a frequency that other performers couldn't quite access. By the time Rourke appeared on the Graham Norton show, that version of him existed primarily in retrospect and what arrived on the red sofa was something harder to characterize and considerably more difficult to interview. Norton has described the Rourke appearance as one of the most genuinely difficult of his career, not because Rourke was hostile or disruptive, but because he was, in some essential way, simply not present. His body occupied the sofa. His name was on the booking. But the quality of engagement that makes an interview, the basic reciprocity of attention and response, was absent in a way that no amount of professional skill could compensate for. From the moment Rourke sat down, the signals were clear to anyone reading them. His posture had the quality of someone who has agreed to attend an event while simultaneously deciding not to participate in it. His eyes moved in directions that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere, occupying spaces that the studio cameras couldn't follow. When Norton asked questions, the responses came slowly and in forms that didn't quite connect to the questions that had prompted them, short, cryptic utterances that might have been fragments of a larger thought, or might have been the complete thought, rendered in a private language that the conversation couldn't decode. Norton tried the things that usually work. He brought up boxing, which Rourke has spoken about at length and with genuine feeling in other contexts. He referenced the film that had brought about Rourke's remarkable late-career resurgence, the comeback story that Hollywood loves, and that audiences had responded to with genuine warmth. He tried gentle humor, the kind that creates a conspiracy between host and guest against the formality of the television format. None of it opened anything. Rourke sat in his silence like a man who had already concluded the interview in his head before it began and found the actual event somewhat beside the point. What struck viewers who watched the episode when it aired was the cumulative effect on Norton himself. By the end of the segment, the host looked drained in a way that the show's usual energy never produces. He had been pouring conversation into a vessel that was, for whatever reason, unable or unwilling to hold it. "You can't fake energy," Norton said afterward. "You can only try to survive the silence." The phrase has become something of a quiet legend among people who follow the mechanics of long-form interviewing, a compressed expression of a very specific professional despair. Rourke wasn't cruel. He wasn't even, by any conventional measure, difficult. He was simply elsewhere, and the distance between where he was and where the show needed him to be was too great for any host to bridge alone. Not every difficult interview is caused by dysfunction. Sometimes the problem is simple incompatibility, a misalignment between what a guest brings and what a format requires that produces not chaos or silence, but something more mundane and in some ways more frustrating. A polite, professional, perfectly civil evening that simply never comes alive. Kevin Costner's appearance on The Graham Norton Show was, by any ordinary measure, entirely unobjectionable. He was polite. He answered questions. He didn't interrupt anyone or collapse into anyone's lap or stare into the middle distance with the intensity of a man communing with invisible presences. He was, in the truest sense of the word, professional. He was also, by Norton's own admission, one of the most exhausting guests the show had ever hosted. The problem was one of register. Costner carries himself with the particular gravity that has defined his screen presence across decades of significant films, a quality that reads beautifully on camera when the story calls for it, and that serves him well in the serious press appearances that accompany serious work. What it does not do, in any version of the experiment that the Norton Show attempted that evening, is translate into the loose, playful, almost anarchic energy that the red sofa requires. The show works when guests surrender, at least temporarily, to its particular logic. That nothing here is too important to laugh at, that the normal defenses of professional image can be lowered for an hour, that the best moments come from people being willing to be slightly ridiculous in a room full of strangers. Costner, to all appearances, had not received this briefing or had received it and declined to apply it. He answered every question with careful, measured precision, giving the impression of a man in an interview he had agreed to conduct on his own terms. When jokes were made, he received them like a man appreciating a demonstration of a foreign custom he has studied but does not practice. When other guests found a comedic rhythm together, he observed from a position of friendly remove, present but not participating, like someone watching a party from across the room through a slightly foggy window. Norton has spoken about that evening with more diplomatic generosity than it perhaps deserved, but the